I was fired on a Tuesday at 10:07 a.m., 3 minutes into a video call that began with, "How are you?" and a pause large enough to park a tram. The HR woman, whose name I'd never learned because she belonged to a different floor and a different species of shoe, read from a script about restructuring and gratitude. My camera was on. Behind me, the Lisbon light was doing its usual trick of making even my apartment's worst corners look honest. I kept my face the way I keep a spreadsheet. Clean, controllable, no surprises. When she said, "Effective immediately," I smiled, too many teeth, and asked if we were talking today immediate or end of day immediate, because I still had a status meeting at past. "Today," she said gently, as if easing me into cold water. I looked at the clock in the corner of the screen and thought, with a clarity that surprised me, that 10:07 was a stupid time for a life to change. 11 would have been symmetrical. They let me keep my laptop long enough to copy a file they promised I could no longer open. I took the plants home in a tote and left the framed certificate that said excellence 3 times without saying anything about sleep. I walked out of the building on Avenida de Liberdade into a city pretending it was spring and stood under a jacaranda tree that had not checked the calendar. The air smelled like coffee and a little like apologies. On the metro to Intendent, I read the separation agreement twice and corrected 2 typos in my head. The words, "for 20 years," wouldn't stop flashing in my brain like a sign that had lost a letter. I had been working since 19, internships that were code for unpayable rent, a junior analyst job where my boss called me kiddo until I became indispensable, then operations, project management, crisis management, managing the people who manage crises. My nickname at the last company was the Surgeon, which sounded flattering until I realized surgeons also cut things out. I got off 1 stop early just to move. I passed the stationery shop on Rua dos Anjos where the owner always says "bom dia," as if he has time to mean it, and for once I didn't hurry past. In the window was a pyramid of colored paper that would have been invisible to any other version of me. The paper pulled at something in my chest that felt like a drawer sliding open. I hadn't thought about origami in years. When I was 8, my upstairs neighbor was a retired librarian named Dona Keiko who served tea in the afternoons and kept a shoebox full of squares in patterned pastels. "Folding is a conversation with paper," she used to say. "You propose. The crease agrees." I would sit at her kitchen table with my elbows off the table because she believed in elbows only for emergencies, and we'd make cranes and sailing boats and foxes with small, smug faces. My mother called it a nice distraction, which is mother language for not serious. By the time I was 12, exams mattered, and by 16 I had learned to measure myself with grades and then by the size of the calendar in my phone. Paper animals fell back into the shoebox. I went into the shop now because the door was open and because open doors are instructions. "Bom dia," said the owner. He was the sort of man who can pronounce staples as if they were poetry. "Can I help?" "I'm looking for paper," I said, and caught myself laughing. "I know that's ridiculous." "Not ridiculous," he said. "Exact." He showed me pads with shimmering blues like tiled kitchen walls, creams like fresh bread, a pack that called itself Ocean and meant it. I bought 3 as if I were smuggling them into a life where paper might be contraband. When I left, I felt the ridiculous high you get after your boss says something kind. It lasted until I reached my door and remembered I no longer had a boss, kind or otherwise. Inside, the silence sat on the sofa like a guest who'd arrived too early. I made coffee because it's what I know how to do when I don't know what to do. I lined the paper on the table as if preparing for surgery. My hands hesitated over the first square, blue, with a scatter of small stars, like a person about to call someone she used to love. I folded corner to corner, then again the muscle memory waking up like a limb that had fallen asleep. At the 4th fold, my throat did a thing I hadn't permitted it in 20 years. I pressed the crease with my nail and felt, violently, the distance between the person who could make time for a useless shape and the person who must justify 30 minutes with a calendar invite. I put the almost crane down and stood very still, because if I moved I was going to cry, and I hadn't cried at half the funerals I attended in those years because someone had to organize the sandwiches. The phone rang. Ines, my best friend since university, does not believe in letting me spiral alone. "Come to my office," she said without hello. I have an empty desk. You can sit and glare at spreadsheets you don't own. I don't want to be the woman who gets fired and then works from a friend's office, I said. You're the woman who got fired and makes croissants at 2 a.m., she said. I don't make croissants, I said. Then come and learn, she said. Or we can just gossip about the people who deserve to be fired. I need an hour, I said. And the weirdest part was that I believed I did. I hung up, took a breath and finished the crane. I placed it on the windowsill, where it watched Lisbon with the indifferent grace of a thing that expects nothing. For the rest of the day, I did nothing that would have satisfied an audit. I made a list titled Things I Am Not, which got petty quickly, and a list titled Things I Could Be, which got ridiculous even faster. I opened my laptop and bookmarked job listings and closed them because my stomach barked like a dog. I sorted a drawer whose contents could have told the story of my 20s if given a patient audience. Wristbands from music festivals, a train ticket to Porto with a heart drawn in the corner, a note from my father in his slow, careful hand, don't forget sunscreen, tucked into a pile of business cards for people whose titles made me tired. At 5, Ines texted a photo of 2 glasses of wine and the caption Emergencia. I went, because my pride is fragile but very thirsty. What happened? She asked when I Saturday restructuring. I said, strategic realignment. Gratitude. Idiots, she said. I would have fired me, I replied automatically. I'm expensive and I make people behave. You make systems behave, she corrected. People are lost causes. We laughed, felt borrowed. Do you want me to be angry on your behalf? She asked. I want to be less calm, I said. I might be broken. You're in shock, she said. It's like anesthesia. Wait for the pain. I'm very good at pain, I said. I schedule it between 9 and 10. She leaned in. What will you do tomorrow? Apply for jobs. Update my CV. Perfect my CV. Reperfect it. Or, she said, you could do the thing you stopped doing before you learned the word KPI. I looked at her. You always say that, I said. And you always ignore me, she said cheerfully. So consider this, 24 hours. No CV. No LinkedIn. You're not allowed to fix your life. You are required to be a person. I don't know how to do that, I said. Good, she said. That means you'll learn something. I promised to try because the word promise still does things to me. The next morning, I did not open my laptop. I went for a walk along the river while the city yawned itself awake. The Tagus was gray like a decision I hadn't made. 2 fishermen argued about nothing on the pier with the kind of conviction that wins elections. Near Kais du Soder, a boy was selling orange juice from a cart shaped like a fruit. I bought one because it was there and because the act of handing €5 to a teenager felt more useful than handing a CV to a portal that would never know my face. Back home, I put the paper back on the table and made 6 cranes before I realized I was holding my breath while I folded. On the 7th, I exhaled on purpose and the crane came out slightly crooked, a left wing that believed in itself too much. I liked it. I lined them up, their small beaks pointing toward the kitchen. I took a photograph and sent it to Ines. Serious business, she replied. It isn't, I wrote back, and then stopped, because the sentence felt old. At noon, my mother called from Porto, where she lives with her window plants and her gossip. How are you? She asked, which is our way of saying 20 things. Fine, I lied, which is our way of saying I don't want to worry you. What happened? She asked. Restructuring, I said. Idiots, she said, borrowing Ines's line. Come here for the weekend. Maybe, I said. I'm folding paper. There was a pause long enough to make soup. Ah, she said carefully, like with Dona Keiko. Yes, I said, and surprise moved through me like caffeine. That was a nice phase, she said, the way you say childhood illnesses were character building. It wasn't a phase, I said, and then had to sit down because the line came out of me without permission. After we hung up, I opened the wardrobe and pulled out shoeboxes like I was raiding an archive. In the second, Under a sweater that had failed 2 winters and been forgiven for both, I found a plastic bag full of paper scraps from a lifetime ago. Wrapping paper with strawberries, old receipts, a corner of a map. At the very bottom, taped to a postcard of azulejos, was a flat, brittle crane, its wings pitched at an angle that suggested it believed in flight. I set it beside the new ones. They looked like distant cousins who might get along if introduced slowly. At 3, I got a message from an unknown number. "Hi, I'm Rue, from the stationery shop. The owner gave me your contact. With permission, we have an origami group at the Jardim de Estrella on Saturdays. It's very unserious, I promise. Come if you like." I nearly wrote, "I'm not a joiner," because that is the sentence a perfectionist uses to disguise fear. Instead I wrote, "Yes." On Saturday, we met under the shade of a plane tree near the bandstand. The group was 5 people and a picnic blanket. Rue, who turned out to be a math teacher with a gentle mouth. A teenager named Joanna, who wore her hair like a banner and her headphones like a threat. An older woman, Sylvia, who folded with the authority of a sergeant. And 2 little boys I never fully separated in my head, brothers who observed fiercely and spoke only to indict. The blanket was a mess of paper. Squares, rectangles, a magazine with a ripped-out page showing a perfect living room. "We usually make whatever the week needs," Rue said. "Cranes if someone is sick. Foxes if someone is being clever. Lilies if someone died. Frogs if we need to laugh." "What do you need?" I asked, not meaning to sound like a person taking minutes. "Structure," he said. "You can be the person who reads the instructions." I laughed because it was either that or cry. I read instructions. We folded. A breeze threw leaves at us like confetti. The little boys snatched them out of the air and tried to fold those too, and we let them, which is the kind of permission that ruins you for offices. Midway through, Joanna swore, then apologized, then swore again because apology is a reflex that sometimes needs to be trained out of girls. Her fox had a crushed nose. "It's okay," I said. "We can restart." "I hate restarting," she muttered. "Me too," I said. "But sometimes the paper remembers better the second time." I showed her the preliminary base again. She watched like a person preparing to escape a room with a lock. When the fox finally looked like a fox, she didn't smile, which I respected. She held it up for inspection like evidence. The little boys approved gravely. We met again the next Saturday and the next. I did not tell anyone I wasn't working, because in Lisbon, not working is a confession and an invitation, and I wasn't ready for either. I told myself I was merely filling the hours until I found the next crisis to manage. My calendar looked like a lagoon at low tide. Pockets of blue surrounded by white where the water had gone out. I applied for exactly 2 jobs and closed both tabs when they asked for enthusiasm. Because enthusiasm had become a door-to-door salesman I refused to let in. I updated my CV with verbs that looked like push-ups. I did not send it. Instead, I walked. I folded. I learned that the fox's personality is in the angle of the snout and that cranes are kinder if you live alone. I learned to accept a ripped edge like weather. I learned that paper has grain and that if you respect it, it behaves. I learned that perfectionism is an insult to certain materials. One afternoon, Rue asked if I would help him teach a workshop at the public library in Campo de Urique. "We expect 8 children," he said. "Maybe 10. 22 turned up, with parents who sat in tiny chairs and watched like prosecuting attorneys. One mother wore a scarf that said, 'I have sued people about Halloween costumes.' I froze. "You were born to schedule," Rue whispered, half teasing. "Use your powers for good." I drew a quick plan with boxes for time and arrows for patience. We taught the water bomb base to a chorus of small groans. A boy with hair like a dandelion insisted on folding everything exactly backward and then insisted, correctly, that it was a fish. The scarf mother sighed audibly when her daughter made a perfectly adequate tulip. At the end, a little girl with purple nail polish pressed her crane against my palm and said, "For luck?" And I pretended not to die. On the tram home, Rue asked what I did for work. I took a breath and told the truth. "I used to run operations for a fintech," I said. "I got fired. I'm between." He nodded as if I'd said a weather report. Are you okay? I keep asking myself that, I said. And what do you answer? That I don't know how to be a person without a problem to solve. He grinned. Then fold 1,000 cranes. It's a problem disguised as a promise. I laughed, but the sentence stuck to me like tissue paper to damp skin. A week later, Sylvia handed me a flyer from the Children's Oncology Ward at Santa Maria Hospital. They're looking for volunteers, she said. Someone to do crafts. Fold, glue, make a mess that can be unmade. You have hands that would be useful. I stared at the paper. Volunteering was something I had scheduled for retirement. I don't know how to talk to sick children, I said. You talk to healthy adults every day, she replied. Surely this is easier. It wasn't. The first afternoon, I ruined my shirt with paste and said the wrong thing to a mother who was brave enough to forgive me quickly. The second afternoon, I learned the name of a boy's favorite stuffed animal and how to fold a dinosaur that looked like it would pay taxes. On the third, I taught a girl named Beatrice to make lilies. Her hands trembled at the fourth fold and stilled at the eighth. On the fourth, a boy died, and the corridor was suddenly a different animal, and for the first time in 20 years I cried where I stood because that was where I was. On the bus home, I pressed my head against the glass and tried to imagine a world where my inbox might have offered me a problem I could solve that felt like that did. Ines called and I told her I was fine, then corrected myself because the truth had become a habit. I cried, I said. I'm proud of you, she said. For crying? For being there, she said. That's harder. That night, under the kitchen light that makes everything look like a decision, I opened the pack of ocean paper and began to fold cranes. I decided, not for belief, just for motion, that I would make 1,000. I had read the story of a girl in Hiroshima who folded cranes in a hospital. I knew the ritual had been adopted and diluted 100 times. I understood the objections. I wanted the rhythm. I made a rule. 10 a day, no perfect ones allowed. I wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it on the kettle so I'd argue with it every morning. I tied a string across the kitchen doorway and hung them in flocks, groups of 10, then clusters that looked like punctuation. On the 5th day, the landlord knocked to ask if I was starting an aviary, and if so, please could I keep it sanitary. On the 20th, my mother visited and stood under the doorway with her head tilted like a tourist. She did not say phase. She took a blue crane home and put it on her television. At 140, Rue asked if I wanted to meet him at the LXFactory on Sunday. There's a woman there who makes installations out of trash, he said. She has a space. She might give you a wall. A wall for what? I asked, alarmed. For your birds, he said, as if discussing a normal commodity. The space was raw and sad and perfect. A corner with white brick and a high window that made the light fall like a prescription. The woman, a sculptor named Leonore, looked at my bag of cranes and said, yes, without pretending to think. Do you want them symmetrical? She asked. Do you want them in a spiral? Do you want them to look like they're escaping? Escaping, I said, too quickly. But some should change their minds mid-flight. She grinned. You're an installation artist who doesn't know it yet. I'm a woman with too much time, I said. She waved a hand. Time is cowardice willing to be brave. I started with string and patience. I climbed a ladder and tied my birds to fishing line and stepped down and stepped back and moved them again. People came through the space pretending to be bored. Some weren't. A small girl asked if she could name them. I said yes, and she gave 200 for the name Joao because all birds are secretly boys, according to the logic of 8-year-olds. An American tourist asked if the piece was about trauma, and I almost said about afternoons. But that sounded too pretentious to sell. When we reached 500, Leonore suggested a sign. Take 1/leave a wish. I bristled. They'll ruin it, I said, and heard the sentence for what it was. Good, she said. Let them ruin it. That's how we know it's alive. We hung a clipboard and a pencil on a string. People wrote wishes that made me want to call them after bedtime and make them drink water. For my father to forgive me, to keep this job, for the doctor to say it's not, for the man on the bridge to step back, for my daughter to stop wanting to be perfect, A little boy printed chocolate in stern letters. Someone wrote a dog, and someone else crossed it out and wrote 2 dogs. When a crane went missing, I flinched, then breathed. The hole it left made the flock more interesting. I tried to remember that sentence. Job offers began to appear. The network of people who respect my calendar more than they respect me had noticed I was free to hire. Some of the offers were flattering. One was obscene. None made me feel the way the boy at the hospital did when his dinosaur finally stood without outside help. I told myself I was being irrational. I told myself I was allowed a season of unprofessionalism. I told myself to decide by June. In May, the CEO of a logistics company asked me to coffee. He was the kind of man who calls the waitress by name because he glanced at her tag. "We need a fixer," he said, and I watched his cufflinks wink at me like voices at a party I don't want to attend. "We need someone who can make lines straight." I pictured my cranes, their consenting chaos. "I'm reconsidering straightness," I said. He smiled in a way that said he wasn't listening. "We have a generous package. Does it include time?" I asked. He looked confused, which was honest. "Time? The kind I can't resell," I said. He told me to think about it. I did. For 2 days I let my mind pretend not to know which way it would go. On the 3rd, I wrote him a letter that included the words, "I can only accept if," 4 times, and then, because honesty had become contagious, I removed everything after if and wrote no. I did not feel brave. I felt like a woman who had said something in a language she was still learning and hoped she had not asked for a pineapple. At the hospital, we started folding 1,000 cranes with the children and the nurses and anyone who entered a room with hands. Beatriz counted with a seriousness that made me love her. A nurse named Tiago turned out to be a genius of paper frogs. We strung them in the corridor like a polite invasion. A mother pressed my fingers and said, "Obrigada," so softly I barely heard it. The boy with the dinosaur went home. On a Sunday morning in June, my mother called and asked if I could come to Porto the next weekend to help her sort the pantry. "Your uncle is coming to paint and needs me to have less in my house," she said, which is how her generation talks about mortality. I went. We opened a cupboard that had been quietly expanding since 1987 and found 3 jars of rice and 4 of grief. I threw away a marmalade that could have testified in court. At the back of the top shelf was a shoebox I recognized before I knew why. "My Keiko box," my mother said softly. She opened it like a church. Inside were squares of paper, faded to meek, and 2 cranes yellowed to the color of memories about butter. There was a note, too, in a hand I hadn't seen since I bought my first bra. "For when you have time," it said. My mother put the note in my palm and closed my fingers around it the way a magician closes a trick. "I wanted to give you this when you married," she said. "Then when you bought an apartment. Then when you got promoted. I forgot that time doesn't arrive like guests. It just is." I sat at her kitchen table, which has held most of the catastrophes of our family without complaint, and folded a crane out of a piece of paper with a print of blue flowers. My mother watched the way people watch children tie their shoes for the first time. She made 1 too badly, cursing under her breath in a way that made me proud. On the train back to Lisbon, I fell asleep and dreamt that I was 8 and trying to fold a dragon out of a page torn from a math workbook. No matter how many times I creased it, it wanted to be a boat. In July, the installation hit 1,000 and I cried in a bathroom I didn't own. People took photos and tagged me even though I hadn't told anyone my name. A journalist from a blog asked if she could interview the artist, and I told her that was a strong word for a person who had simply kept going. She laughed and wrote a generous piece anyway. She asked me what the cranes meant and I said, "Patience," and then added "and surrender," because both words had begun to taste like food. A week later, the city council wrote to ask if I would be willing to do something for a new community center opening in Marvila. "We have a wall," the email said. "We have a budget that will insult you. We have people who will remember the day if you come." I took the job because I have a soft spot for insulting budgets that ask the right question. I asked the library to save me their torn and outdated pages, the bakery to save me their bright boxes, the local print shop to save the offcuts. I decided to make a mural of cranes in the shape of the Tagus, a river of birds that changed color where the light in the room did. We sat on the floor and folded with grandmothers and kids and men who had been in rooms with locked doors for several years. One of them, a quiet person named Miguel with a mustache that told stories, folded with the care of a surgeon. "It's like the paper is teaching my hands," he said. And I wrote that sentence down because it was exactly right. On opening day, the room was so full of people that the cranes moved in a draft we hadn't accounted for. The birds became a tide. A girl wrote, in shaky letters, "I want to be less afraid," and pinned it under the blue arc for courage. The councilwoman made a speech that mentioned me twice and us 10 times, which is the correct ratio, and afterward we ate pastel de nata with plastic forks because we were civilized but not impossible. By autumn, I had a routine that looked nothing like a schedule and everything like a life. Mornings for folding, for walking, for the hospital. Afternoons for small paid projects that didn't ask me to apologize for gravity. Signage for a bakery window, a set of folded centerpieces for a wedding where the bride didn't want flowers to die in her name, an installation in a startup office where the CEO insisted on calling them our flock, which made me itch but paid nicely. Evenings for friends and for the quiet, scribbled paperwork of being a person. Some days I missed the heat of a high-stakes day, the way a decision can turn oxygen into noise. Some nights I lay awake and added columns in my head just to feel clever. There were hours when the cranes looked like denial, when I wondered if I had built a pretty room to sit in while my ambition cooled. On those days, I called Ines and told her I was thinking of going back, and she asked, "To what?" in a tone that politely dismantled the question. "There's a job open at Aquarella Capital," I would say, and she would say, "They eat people with small spoons." And I would laugh and hang up and press a crease and feel better. In November, Beatriz rang the bell on her last day at the ward. She ran down the corridor with a crane in each hand and a grin that made my knees untrustworthy. Her mother hugged me with bones. "You made Tuesdays last year," she said. And I pretended to joke because joking is how I don't cry in front of strangers. At Christmas, my mother and I folded a nativity scene from catalog pages. The baby Jesus was a fat little triangle with a smirk that made my uncle uncomfortable, which became a family tradition immediately. I gave Ines a mobile of tiny foxes and she hung it in her office just to confuse the men who came in to negotiate as if she were a soft chair. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the terrace and watched the fireworks turn the city into a sequence of excellent mistakes. I did not make a resolution. I made a plan to keep, not a promise, a plan. 1 hospital day a week, 1 community class a month, 1 project that paid rent without demanding my soul, 1 day to do nothing on purpose. In January, a museum in Belém asked if I would join a group show about care. I told Leonor I didn't want to say anything about care in a room where people drank white wine and pretended it was conversation. She said, "Then don't say anything. Hang your cranes and let them find the air." I said yes and then almost didn't, because self-sabotage is the last religion to abandon. In the end, we installed a field of dangling birds and a station where people could write something they wanted to put down. The little pencil didn't stop. The room sounded like prayer if prayer had paper. On the final day, an elderly man with hands like maps stood under the cranes and told me he had been a tailor for 42 years. "I measured men who wanted to look like themselves," he said. Then I stopped. I didn't know what to do with my hands for a year. He held out his palms to the paper storm. "This helps." After the show, the museum sent me a check that didn't make me feel like a thief and a letter that called me an artist without quotation marks. I put the letter on my fridge like a child with an A. I did not believe it. I believed it enough to keep folding. Spring came like a rumor. The cranes in my kitchen faded a little in the sun. Sometimes I replaced them. Sometimes I let them suggest that time can be kind to things we stop polishing. The hospital asked if I would train new volunteers, and I wrote a set of instructions that included arrive early, wash your hands, don't promise, and at the end, say, I don't know if you don't. I taught a class that included a businessman who kept correcting me and a teenager who kept fixing my mistakes. I learned to let the teenager lead. One night, after a day of tiny intact moments, I took the metro to Santa Apollonia and walked along the river until I reached the place where the fishermen lean on the barrier and consider the water like a partner they will never leave. I threw a paper boat into the Tagus and watched it lurch, correct, fail, succeed, fail. A man next to me said, "That's not how boats work." And I said, "Exactly." And we both laughed. I will not tell you that everything stayed soft. Money is a character that insists on lines. Twice I said yes to work I didn't want because the number sang. Once I said yes to a man who looked like a better idea than he was. At least once a month, I opened job listings and found myself shopping for a version of security that never fit. In March, a consulting firm asked me to run a project in Madrid for 3 months and I nearly went. Then I pictured the hospital corridor and the kitchen doorway and the girls who swear when their foxes fail and I wrote, "Thank you, no." I half regretted it for a week and then forgot for a month and then remembered only as a cautionary tale. In April, Rue told me he was moving to Coimbra for love, the only reason I accept, and Joanna announced she had been accepted to an engineering school that would not know what to do with her mouth and would learn. We met in the garden for a farewell folding and made boats that we refused to put in the fountain because we are not anarchists. The little boys, taller now, informed me that cranes cannot actually fly unless you glue them to pigeons. I said that sounded illegal and they said only in some countries. I asked Rue what he would do in Coimbra. "Teach," he said. "Fold. Be foolish." "Is that enough?" I asked out of habit. "It's not a pot," he said. "I don't need to fill it. I need to sit." I wrote that down too. The day before he left, we went to the LXFactory and stood under the installation that was by then a series of holes and additions, a permanent draft. There was a wish clipped to the board in a careful hand. "I want to stop being the person who writes lists and become the person who lives them." I traced the letters and didn't pretend it wasn't mine. A year after the Tuesday call, the HR woman wrote to ask if I would fill out an alumni survey about life after. I almost deleted it because the phrase made me angry. Life after? After what? After certainty? After salary? After the trick where you can say, "I'm tired," and people applaud? Instead, I filled it out with honest, unhelpful answers. Question: Are you satisfied with your current career path? The word path assumes an end. I have a garden. Sometimes it grows mint. Sometimes weeds. I put water on both. Question: Have your earnings increased or decreased? Money went down. Mornings went up. I am wealthy in a currency you cannot audit. Question: What is your 5-year plan? To keep a chair in my kitchen for anyone who needs to sit and fold. I did not send it. I kept it in a folder called Time. If you had asked me at 19 what success would look like at 40, I would have said a corner office and the sort of wardrobe that suggests boarding passes. If you had asked me at 30, I would have said impact, because I had started to confuse the volume of my calendar with the size of my life. At 40, fired at 10:07 on a Tuesday, I would have said a solution. I did not have one. What I have now is a room where paper birds change their minds mid-flight. A hospital corridor where a boy with a dinosaur face asks if I can hold the tape because his hands are busy being brave. A mother who sends me photos of her television with a blue crane perched like a ridiculous angel. A friend who calls to remind me to eat when I forget. A city that smells like coffee and sometimes like rain and often like both. A daughter I don't have to impress because she exists only in the children I meet and the girl I pretended not to be. A box of paper squares by the kettle, like medicine for a disease my doctors never named. When I fold, I can feel my old perfectionism trying to take the wheel. It wants sharp corners and apologies for soft edges. I let it in sometimes. Then I make a deliberate mistake and place that bird next to the others and invite it to belong. The last crane I hung in the LXFactory installation was made from a page of my old CV. I folded the phrases into the wings. Cross-functional stakeholder engagement disappears at the squash fold. Exemplary performance review becomes a mountain that offers no particular view. Drove results hides in the belly where I can still feel it if I press. I hung it at the edge where the birds look like they're about to leave the wall and see what the room will do without them. A girl in a yellow coat stopped and pointed. "That one looks like it's laughing," she said. "Maybe it is," I said. "Why?" she asked. "Because it isn't a plan anymore," I said. "It's a thing that exists." I walked home along the river and the water did its usual, unastonishing miracle of being alive. A tram bell rang. A dog taught itself a new trick. Someone argued with love in a doorway. I let the late sun warm my face for a minute longer than my old schedule would have allowed. Then I climbed my stairs and opened the door to my apartment, and the cranes in the kitchen stirred, not because of wind or because of me, but because the room had its own weather now, and I had learned to live in it. That night, I folded one more bird without counting. I gave it the ugliest paper in the box, the one with a misprint that turns flowers into strange mistakes, and I liked it better for being wrong. I set it on the windowsill with the first one, the brittle blue with stars. They looked at each other like sisters who had finally decided to be kind. I turned off the lights and the city held its breath and let it out again, and nothing about my life was perfect, and I went to sleep happy.